You have 90 days, Miss Bennett. After that, this ranch belongs to the bank." Sophia didn't answer him with words. She picked up the shotgun leaning against the porch post and leveled it at Gerald Foss's chest until the man in the pressed suit forgot how to breathe. "Get off my land." Foss left. Fast. Behind the barn, a quiet cowboy who had worked her ranch for 2 weeks heard every word and went completely still. Not from fear, from recognition. He already knew what was coming. She had no idea yet who he really was. If you've ever fought alone for something that was rightfully yours, this story will reach straight into your chest. Stay with us to the very end. Subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Sophia remembered that detail because Tuesdays were the days she rode the north fence line, the longest stretch of the property, the one her father had always called the backbone of the ranch. She'd been out there when the postboy rode up, and she'd tucked it inside her jacket without opening it because she already knew what it was. She'd been expecting it for 6 weeks. She just hadn't wanted to be right. She opened it that evening at the kitchen table. Boots, still muddy hair, still wind-tangled, and she read it twice before she set it down. The First Territorial Bank of Harlan County was formally notifying her that her outstanding loan balance along with accumulated interest penalties she had never been informed existed had reached a threshold requiring immediate review. A representative would be visiting the property within the fortnight to conduct an assessment of the ranch's current operating value. Assessment. She said the word out loud to the empty kitchen, and it tasted exactly like what it was, a threat wearing a suit. Her father, William Bennett, had taken that loan 11 years ago to rebuild after a drought year wiped out half their herd. He'd paid it faithfully for 9 of those years. When he died suddenly in February, a heart that quit without warning while he was working the fence line in the cold, Sophia had taken over every obligation he'd left behind. She'd made every payment since, every single one. She had the receipts in a lockbox under her bed, organized by month and year in her own hand. And yet, here was this letter inventing penalties she'd never heard of, claiming a balance that matched nothing in her own records. She didn't sleep that night. She was at the table before first light, with her ledger books spread wide, and the lamp burning low, going through every number again. The ranch's finances were not complicated. She'd made sure of that. 63 head of cattle, a growing horse breeding program, a hay contract with 2 neighboring farms, a monthly payroll for 4 hands. Everything accounted for. Everything clear. Everything except the bank's numbers. She was still at that table when the knock came. 5:15 in the morning. The sky outside the color of ash. She reached for the small revolver on the shelf by the door. Not fear, just habit, and opened the door to find a man standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and a worn leather saddlebag over one shoulder. Tall, wide through the shoulders, in the way that came from real work. His face was weathered, but not old somewhere. The sun and wind had written more than the years had. And his eyes, when they met hers, were a quiet, steady gray that didn't flinch at the revolver. "Morning, ma'am." Low and even, the voice of a man who'd learned a long time ago that volume didn't solve anything. "Saw your notice at the feed store. Said you were looking for an experienced hand. I'm looking for work." Sophia looked at him, the way she looked at everything these days, like it might be trying to take something from her. "Notice went up 3 weeks ago. Been writing. Took me a while to get here." "From where?" A small pause. Not guilty, more like a man deciding how much detail was strictly necessary. "South. Texas before that. Kansas before that. Lot of ranches between Texas and Nebraska." "Yes, ma'am. Worked some of them." She studied him. No puffed-up quality. No performance. He wasn't sizing up the property the way men did when they saw a woman alone and thought opportunity. He was just standing there, honest as fence posts, waiting. Name, Levi Hunter. References, 2 ranchers. I'll write the names down, you wire them both. I will. She looked at his boots. Old but cared for. His hands, years of real work written into them. I pay fair wages for fair work. Bunkhouse is around back. 3 other hands, they'll tell you the rules. You follow my lead. Do the job right. You've got a place here. You decide you know better than I do how to run my ranch. You're gone before sundown. Understood. Understood. You eat breakfast. He blinked. Hadn't expected that. Not yet. Kitchen doors around the side. Coffee's on. Biscuits from yesterday. She stepped back. I'll be in directly. She closed the door, leaned against it, stood there with her eyes shut for 10 seconds. She needed another hand. That was the plain truth. With the bank circling and a property assessment coming, she needed every acre running at full strength. She couldn't afford pride. She picked the letter up off the table, put it in the lockbox with the receipts. Then she went to pour herself more coffee. Levi Hunter was a quiet man. Not the closed-off silence of someone hiding something, but the quiet of a person who had learned that words were most valuable when they were the right ones. He listened more than he spoke. He observed before he acted. He was never told something twice. He had a feel for cattle that some men spent a lifetime chasing. A patience with the animals that made the work go faster and smoother than it had any right to. He fixed things before he was asked. He didn't grumble. He didn't try to renegotiate his wages after 3 days the way the last man she'd hired had attempted. By the end of the first week, Danny, her youngest hand, had taken to following Levi around the way young men did when they recognized they could learn something real. Old Pete, who had worked this ranch since before Sophia's father passed and whose judgment she trusted above almost anyone's, gave her a single nod when she asked what he thought of the new man. Old Pete's nods said more than most people's paragraphs. On the 9th day, Gerald Foss arrived. He came in a buggy too clean for these roads, wearing a suit, too pressed for this county, with a face that couldn't quite decide whether it wanted to be friendly or condescending, and kept landing somewhere between the two. Sophia met him on the porch. Ledgers. Receipts. Every document relating to that loan organized in a leather folder she'd been up until midnight putting together. And her jaw set in a way that Danny would later describe to Levi as the look that means somebody's about to find out they made a mistake. Mrs. Bennett. Miss Bennett. She corrected him without heat, just precision. My father was Mr. Bennett. Foss adjusted. The loan your father took out in 1882 included a compounding interest clause that, I have my copy of the loan document. She held up the folder. The interest rate is fixed at 6% annually. There is no compounding clause. The bank's records indicate, I have receipts for every payment made since 1882, 11 years of them, organized by date. I'm happy to spend the next 3 hours doing arithmetic with you because I've already done it and my numbers don't match yours, by a significant amount. Foss was not a man who liked being challenged. She could see that clearly. But he was also a man who hadn't expected this degree of preparation from the woman he'd ridden out to see. He took the folder, looked through it, made some notes, told her the bank would review its records and be in contact. He left. Sophia waited until the buggy was gone. Then she sat down on the porch steps and put her face in her hands. Not crying, just breathing. She heard footsteps. Levi was coming up from the barn. He'd been close enough to hear. She could tell by his expression, careful in a way that was different from his usual careful. You all right? I'm fine. He didn't push it. He came and sat on the step below hers, leaving space, and looked out across the property. They're saying your father's loan has different terms than your copy shows. That's what they're saying. And your copy is the original. My father kept every piece of paper that ever crossed this ranch. The copy I have was in his files the day I buried him. Levi was quiet. You know what that sounds like? I know exactly what it sounds like. Neither of them said the word. They were both thinking it. Fraud. I could look at the numbers with you, Levi said, if you wanted another set of eyes. She looked at him. No quality of trying to take over, just offering. You have experience with figures. Some. More than I probably let on. She studied him one moment longer. Then she stood, picked up the folder, and went back inside. She left the door open behind her. He followed. They spent 2 hours at the kitchen table that night. Sophia spread everything out, loan documents, payment receipts, her running ledger. Levi read without talking, going still the way he did when he was concentrating, barely seeming to breathe. His notes were clean and precise on the separate sheet he wrote on. More precise than a ranch hand's handwriting had any business being. Sophia noticed. She filed it away without saying anything. After an hour, he set his pencil down. Your payment history is clean. Everything lines up. He turned his notepad toward her and pointed to a column of figures. But look at this. He'd pulled her cattle sale prices and cross-referenced them against numbers she'd noted from conversations with neighboring ranchers. Your cattle have been consistently assessed below market value, on every sale, not by a little. Sophia stared at the column. How much? 15 to 20% below what comparable herds in this county have been selling for. The number hit her like something physical. 15 to 20%. Over 2 years. Dozens of sales. That was real money. Money that should have been in her accounts, money that would have made her loan balance look very different from what the bank was claiming. Who sets the assessment prices? Levi's voice was still quiet. But something underneath it had changed. Something focused. Buyers use assessors, certified by the county land office. Sophia's voice had gone very still. The land office is chaired by... She stopped. Who? Thomas Granger. She closed her eyes for just a moment. Who sits on the board of the First Territorial Bank of Harlan County? The silence stretched between them. Sophia. His voice was careful. Has anyone else in the county had trouble with the bank? Any of your neighbors? She thought about the Callahan family sold last spring, at a price everyone said was shockingly low. Old Marcus Webb, telling her at the feed store he was thinking about selling, said the numbers just weren't working anymore. The Hendersons up north new loans, twice in 3 years, to cover costs they couldn't account for. Yes, she said slowly. I think a lot of people have. Levi looked down at his notes. Then this isn't just about your ranch. Those words landed differently than she expected. She had been so deep in her own fight, her own fear, her own refusal to lose what her father built, that she hadn't stepped back far enough to see the larger shape of it. This isn't just about your ranch. What are you saying? Her voice was quiet. Her eyes were sharp on his face. He looked up. And for just a fraction of a second, the briefest flash, something moved across his expression that was more complicated than a hired hand's reaction to a bookkeeping problem. Something that looked almost like recognition, like a man who already knew the answer and was carefully choosing not to give it yet. Then it was gone. He turned the notepad face down. You might need more than your own records to fight this. He stood, picked up his hat. Get some sleep, Sophia. Tomorrow's early. He walked out through the kitchen door. She sat at the table long after he left, staring at nothing, thinking about that expression on his face, how fast it had come and gone, how deliberately. 2 weeks passed with the particular quality of time that felt ordinary on the surface and wasn't. Levi worked. The ranch worked. Danny asked questions, and Levi answered them with patience. Sophia watched from a distance and was grateful for. Old Pete and Levi settled into the wordless rhythm of two men who respected each other's competence without needing to discuss it. In the evenings, 2 or 3 nights a week, Levi and Sophia sat at the kitchen table. They were building something, though neither named it aloud. A record. A documentation of her ranch's finances, cattle prices, loan history, every bank interaction. Levi asked methodical questions, and Sophia answered them, and together they were shaping something that was moving toward an argument, toward a case, though neither used that word. He also asked about the neighboring ranches, who had sold land recently, who was struggling, who had borrowed from the bank and found the terms confusing. He asked casually, but she had learned in those weeks that nothing Levi Hunter did was as casual as it appeared. She didn't know what to do with that knowledge yet. What she knew was simpler and more unsettling. She trusted him. She hadn't expected to. 2 years of running this ranch alone, 2 years of being told by bankers and buyers and neighbors that she was in over her head, that the land would go better in a man's hands, had made her careful about people. But Levi was different in a way she couldn't articulate. He didn't want anything from her that wasn't fair. He said his piece once when he disagreed and let it go. He treated her decisions as hers. He asked her what she thought, and he listened to the answer like it mattered. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed being asked what she thought. On the Thursday of the third week, Gerald Foss came back. This time he brought Arthur Vance, senior account manager, smoother than Foss, better practiced with the specific technique of two men positioning a person between them and expecting the weight to be enough. Sophia met them on the porch, folder in hand, considerably thicker than before. "Miss Bennett." Vance's voice was tailored silk. "We appreciate your diligence. However, the bank's position remains." "I'd like you to explain the compounding interest clause," she said. "The specific language, because I've read my loan agreement 3 times and there is no such clause." Vance smiled. The particular smile. "There may be some confusion about which version of the document. There is one version, the one both parties signed, which I have." She held the folder up. "Do you have a different version?" Something shifted behind his eyes. "Miss Bennett, the bank has authority to assess any property against which a loan is secured. My accounts are current, every payment made on time. What I don't have is an explanation for why my cattle have been assessed 15 to 20% below market value for 2 years running." She held his gaze. "I've done the arithmetic. I'm happy to share it." In the silence that followed, she heard the barn door. She didn't look. But she heard Levi's footsteps, the particular weight of his step, and she knew he'd come out and was standing somewhere behind her. Vance heard it too. He glanced in that direction, and something happened in his face. Something small, barely visible. A flicker that didn't belong there. Like a man who had just seen something he hadn't expected to see. She didn't understand it in that moment. Later she would. "We'll be in contact, Miss Bennett." Vance's voice had changed. More careful now. More correct. "The bank will review the assessment records." "In writing," she said. "With a timeline." "Of course." They left. She waited until the buggy disappeared. Then she turned. Levi was standing 20 feet away, arms folded, watching the direction the buggy had gone with an expression she had never seen on his face before. "They'll be back," she said. "Yes." No hesitation, like he knew the shape of what was coming. "Levi." She stepped toward him. His eyes came to hers. "What are you not telling me?" A long moment of silence. "I'm not ready to answer that yet." "That's not a no." "No," he said quietly. "It's not." She held his gaze. His eyes weren't blank was what liars gave you. His eyes were the eyes of a man holding himself back from something for reasons he believed were sound and was no longer entirely sure they were. She went back inside. She did not sleep well. The answer came 10 days later. Not from him. From Kansas. She'd wired both references the mornings after he arrived. The Kansas rancher's response came back by courier faster than post, which itself told her something. The man confirmed Levi had worked his property for 6 weeks 2 years back. Excellent worker. Completely trustworthy. And then, at the bottom, a paragraph he'd clearly felt compelled to add, "I should mention." "I was aware, though, Levi did not tell me directly that he had significant business interests in the region. He came to my property for his own reasons, which were legitimate, though not what he represented them to be. I will say only that his character is sound, that he dealt honestly with me in the end, and that I would trust him with anything that mattered." She read it 4 times. Business interests in the region. Not what he represented them to be. She put the letter in the lockbox. Then she went to find him. He was at the water trough, fixing a cracked fitting sleeves rolled up. He heard her coming and looked up, and she could see from his face that he'd been expecting this conversation for some time. "Who are you?" she said. He set down the wrench. The pause that followed was not a man deciding whether to lie. It was a man deciding how to tell a truth that was long overdue. "I'm Levi Hunter. That's my real name. I haven't lied to you about that. But there are things I haven't told you." She waited. He reached into his jacket laid over the fence rail and produced a card. Plain. Good paper. Simple design. She took it. "Levi Hunter. Hunter Financial Group. Denver, Colorado." She looked at it, Then she looked at him. "Hunter Financial Group," she said. "My company. Founded it 12 years ago. We operate across 6 territories: land, cattle, transportation." A pause. Banking. The word landed between them like a stone. "The First Territorial Bank of Harlan County," she said slowly, "has been under your company's review. For 8 months. We had reason to believe there were systemic issues, loan manipulations, fraudulent assessments, coordination with county officials to suppress land values and force sales." He met her eyes without flinching. "When I came here, I came as what I told you, someone looking for work. I wanted to understand what was happening on the ground before making decisions from behind a desk." The words settled over her like something falling from a height. She realized her hand had closed around the card until the edges cut into her palm. "You let me hire you as a ranch hand." "Yes." "You sat at my table every week looking at my numbers. To help you. Every minute of it was real. But you already knew." The words came harder than she intended. She didn't pull them back. "You already knew what they were doing. You were investigating it before you ever walked through my gate. I knew there was a pattern. I didn't know your specific situation. I didn't know how bad the assessment manipulation was until we went through your records together." He held her gaze. "Both things are true, Sophia. They don't cancel each other out." She stared at him. "One thing," she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "Do you own any part of the bank that is trying to take my land?" The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to tell her the answer before he spoke it. "My company has a minority ownership interest." He kept his voice steady. "Which is exactly why I came in person instead of sending someone else. Because when the review findings came in, I needed to see it myself. What they've been doing to you and to the other families in this county, it's fraud. I intend to deal with it." "How convenient," Sophia said, "that you intend to deal with the problem your own company helped create." He absorbed that without deflecting. "That's fair," he said. She turned and walked back toward the house. She didn't slam the door. She was too tired to slam doors. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd let herself feel for the first time in 2 years, like she wasn't entirely alone in this fight, and she put both hands flat on the wood, and she breathed. The business card was still in her hand. She set it on the table. Outside, she could hear him. The creak of the pump fitting being worked back into place. A man who hadn't packed his bags, hadn't offered more excuses, hadn't done anything except go back to doing the job. She opened her eyes. She had 63 head of cattle being undervalued, a loan being misrepresented, neighbors losing land for reasons they didn't understand, and a man outside who, whatever else he was, had more information about what was really happening in Harlan County than anyone she had ever met. She picked up the business card. She put it in the lockbox. Then she opened the ledger and started over from the beginning, because whatever came next, she was walking into it, knowing every number cold, knowing every piece of evidence, knowing the full shape of what had been done. She was a Bennett, and she had not come this far to hand anything over to anyone, not the bank, not even a man who, whatever else he was, had looked at her across that table every week like she was the most capable person he'd ever sat across from. Not yet. She didn't go to bed that night. She sat at that table until the lamp burned low, and the numbers in her ledger stopped swimming in front of her eyes and became solid again, fixed, real, irrefutable. Every payment, every cattle sale, every assessment figure that came in below what she'd been told the market would bear. She laid it all out in sequence, because sequence was what made the pattern visible, and the pattern was the whole point. By the time the first gray light started coming through the window, she had 3 pages of notes in her own handwriting. 3 pages that told a story so clear and so deliberate that she felt sick looking at it. This hadn't been carelessness. This hadn't been the ordinary slippage of an institution that had grown too large and too comfortable. This had been a plan. Someone had sat down and designed this step by careful step, and it had been working for years before she'd ever thought to question it. She heard boots on the porch at 5:15. She didn't move from the table. The knock on the kitchen door was quiet, measured. "Come in." Levi opened the door and stopped when he saw her. He took in the lamp, the ledger, the notes, the fact that she was still dressed in yesterday's clothes, and he didn't say anything immediately. He set his hat on the hook by the door, the way he always did, like he wasn't sure whether he still had the right, but he did it anyway. "You didn't sleep." "No." He came to the table and looked at what she'd laid out without touching it. His eyes moved across the pages with the same focused stillness she'd noticed the first night they'd done this together. The same quality of attention that she now understood came from years of looking at financial documents and knowing exactly what he was looking for. She watched him. "How long have you known it was fraud?" Her voice was even. She'd decided overnight that she wasn't going to let her anger make her imprecise. Imprecision was a luxury she couldn't afford. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. 8 months ago, we started seeing a pattern in the bank's regional reports. Properties in this county selling well below assessed value. Loan default rates that didn't match the economic conditions. Landowners losing properties they should have been able to keep. He paused. I sent 2 men to investigate quietly. They confirmed enough to bring me here personally. And the men you sent, were they also passing themselves off as ranch hands? No. They worked through the county assessor's office. Asked questions about land records. He met her eyes. You're the only place I came personally. That landed differently than she expected it to. Why? I was quiet for a moment. Because the Bennett Ranch kept showing up in the records in a way that didn't fit the rest of the pattern. Every other property that was being targeted, the owners had already started showing signs of giving in, selling or taking on more debt, or both. A pause. Your numbers were being manipulated the same way everyone else's were, but you hadn't moved. You kept paying, you kept pushing back, and nobody could figure out why you were still standing when you shouldn't have been by their numbers. Sophia stared at him. They thought I should have broken already. By their calculations, yes. Something cold moved through her. So you came to find out why I hadn't. I came to find out what was actually happening on this property versus what the bank was reporting. He leaned forward slightly. What I found was a woman who was keeping better books than the bank was, who had documentation they weren't expecting her to have, who had been quietly building a case without knowing that's what she was doing. He paused. You weren't just surviving their scheme, Sophia. You were accidentally dismantling it. She looked down at her 3 pages of notes. She had spent the night feeling afraid and furious and betrayed and utterly alone. And now a man was sitting across from her, telling her that the work she'd done out of pure stubbornness and the determination not to be wrong about her own finances had produced something more valuable than she'd known. She didn't know what to do with that. You should have told me who you were, she said. Yes. From the beginning. Yes. No qualification, no defense, just the word flat and honest. Why didn't you? He was quiet for longer this time. When he spoke, his voice had a different quality, something stripped back, something she hadn't heard from him before. Because I've learned in 12 years of running a company and going into situations like this one that people behave differently when they know who's watching. I needed to see this ranch as it actually was, not as anyone wanted to present it to me. He paused. And I needed to know whether what I thought about you was real, or whether it was something I was constructing because it was convenient. What you thought about me, that you were exactly who you appeared to be. His eyes were steady on hers. In my experience, that's rarer than it should be. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the ranch starting up. Danny's voice somewhere near the barn, the familiar sound of horses, the ordinary machinery of a place that was still running because she had refused to let it stop. I need to know something, Sophia said, and I need a straight answer. All right. Does your company benefit from what happens to this ranch? Either outcome, I keep it or I lose it. Is there any version of this where Hunter Financial Group gains something from my situation? He held her gaze. No. My company profits from healthy land economies, not from foreclosures. What's happening in this county is bad for every business interest I have in this region. He paused. I'm not here because exposing this corruption helps my bottom line. I'm here because it's the right thing to do, and because I am personally responsible for having had a financial interest in an institution that was being used to steal from people." She studied his face. She'd learned over 3 weeks how to read him, or thought she had. Now she was reading him with new information, recalibrating everything, looking for the places where the performance and the reality didn't quite match. She couldn't find them. That scared her a little, because it meant either he was telling the truth, or he was so accomplished at deception that she'd never be able to tell the difference. She pulled the ledger toward her. "Fine," she said. "Then tell me what we do with this." He looked at the ledger, then at her, and something in his expression shifted the careful restraint of the past weeks, giving way to something that looked almost like relief. "First," Levi said, "we need the other ranchers." Getting the other ranchers was harder than it sounded. Sophia spent 4 days riding out to neighboring properties alone without Levi because she knew these families, and he didn't, and because she understood that showing up with a stranger would close more doors than it opened. She went to the Callahan place, to the Webbs, to the Hendersons, to 3 other families whose names had appeared in her conversations with Levi, and whose financial situations she'd started to recognize as variations on her own. What she found was worse than she'd expected. The Callahan family had already sold. 18 months ago, at a price that now, with the pattern visible, she could see had been engineered down over years of manipulated assessments. They'd taken the money and moved north, and what was left of the family, the elderly father still working. A piece of rented ground shook his head when she laid out what she understood, and his eyes went wet in a way he clearly hadn't expected. "I knew something was wrong," Tom Callahan said. "I just couldn't prove it. And I was tired. God, I was just so tired." She drove back from the Callahan place with his words following her, and she thought about tired, what it meant to be ground down, slowly, steadily, by forces that were designed to look like bad luck and your own inadequacy instead of like a scheme. That was the cruelest part of it. You didn't just lose your land. You lost your confidence that you'd ever had the right to it. The Hendersons were still fighting, but barely. Margaret Henderson, who had taken over management of the property after her husband's accident 3 years back, had the look of a woman who had been holding something heavy for too long. She listened to Sophia's explanation with an expression that moved through disbelief and into a kind of grim, resigned recognition. "The assessment man," Margaret said. "Every time. Every single time I sell ahead, the price comes back lower than what I heard other people were getting, and the man always has an explanation. Drought impact on quality, market fluctuation, transportation costs." She paused. "I stopped arguing because I thought I was wrong. I thought I must be misunderstanding something." "You weren't wrong," Sophia said. "They were counting on you thinking that." Marcus Webb, who was 71 and had ranched this county for 40 years, sat with his hands on his knees and listened to Sophia for 30 minutes without interrupting. When she finished, he said very quietly, "What do we do?" That was the question. When she got back to the ranch on the 4th evening, Levi was waiting for her on the porch. He'd been working all day, she could tell by the state of him, but he'd also clearly been watching for her return. "How many?" "6 families still on their land who have the same problem. One who's already lost it." She handed him her horse's reins, and he took them without comment. "They're scared. And angry. And they've been isolated long enough that some of them thought they were the only ones." "That's deliberate," Levi said. "Isolation is part of the strategy. If you never compare notes with your neighbor, you never see the pattern." "I know." She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at him. "Marcus Webb wants to know what we do. They all do. I told them I had someone helping me who understood how the bank worked." She paused. "I didn't tell them who you were." He looked at her. "You should have. I wanted to ask you first." Her voice was even. "Because when I bring you into a room with 6 families who have been cheated and are looking for someone to be angry at, I need to be honest with them about what you are. Both things. The man who's been helping me, and the man who had a stake in the institution that's been robbing them." She held his gaze. "Can you stand in a room with those people and be honest?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes, I can." The meeting was at her ranch 3 days later. She'd thought about a neutral location, but neutral locations felt like evasion, and she was done with evasion. She cleared the large table in her front room and put out chairs, and the Hendersons came, and Marcus Webb, and two of the other families, and they arrived with the careful, guarded quality of people who wanted to believe something could be fixed, but had stopped betting on it. Levi was already inside when they arrived. He was standing by the fireplace, not performing anything, just standing there in the same clothes he worked in, and Sophia introduced him the way she'd decided she would introduce him, simply and fully, leaving nothing out. "This is Levi Hunter. He's been working my ranch for the past month as a hand. He's also the founder of Hunter Financial Group out of Denver, which has a minority interest in the First Territorial Bank." She looked at each face in the room as she said it, watching the reactions move through. "He came here to investigate what the bank was doing. He helped me figure out what was happening to my accounts. And before any of you say anything, I'll tell you that I was furious when I found out who he was. I still have questions, but I also know he's the only person in this county who has both the documentation and the authority to do something about what's been done to us." The silence in the room had a weight to it. Margaret Henderson was the first to speak. "You had money in the bank that was robbing us." "Yes," Levi said. "And you didn't know." "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know the specifics until I came here." He paused. "That's not an excuse. It's the reason I'm standing in this room instead of handling it from a distance." Tom Callahan's elderly father, who hadn't been expected to come, but had shown up anyway, driven by his son's youngest boy, leaned forward in his chair. His voice was raspy, and his hands shook slightly, but his eyes were sharp. "My family sold our land for 40 cents on the dollar because we didn't know we were being lied to. What does a man from Denver do about that?" Levi looked at him directly. "I can't give you back what's already gone," he said. "I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. What I can do is make sure it stops, and make sure the people responsible answer for it, and try to get every family in this room every dollar they're still owed." "How?" Levi looked at Sophia. She'd known this moment was coming. She'd prepared for it. She went to the shelf and brought out the folder. The expanded version, now pages and pages of documented evidence. Every piece of information she'd gathered and organized over the past weeks. "Because of this," she said. "Because we have the records. All of us together, if every family in this room brings their documentation, we have something no one person could have alone." She set the folder on the table. "We have a pattern. And a pattern is a case." Margaret Henderson stared at the folder. Then she reached into the bag she'd brought with her and pulled out her own bundle of papers. Her own receipts. Her own records, bundled with string and looking like they'd been held onto with fierce and frightened determination for years. She put them on the table next to Sophia's folder. One by one, the others followed. Levi watched each paper join the pile with an expression that was very controlled, but not entirely. Something moved across his face that looked, if Sophia had to name it, like the specific quality of a man who had gone into a situation expecting to find evidence of wrongdoing and had not been quite prepared for the human weight of what that evidence represented. Marcus Webb put his papers down last. His hand stayed on them for a moment before he let go. "Tell us what to do," he said, and Levi opened the folder and started talking. He talked for 2 hours. He was methodical, and he was clear. And he used language that the people in that room could follow without making them feel talked down. To which was something Sophia noticed and filed away as a quality she hadn't expected from a man who ran a company that operated across 6 territories. He laid out exactly what the bank had been doing in plain terms. He explained the specific mechanism of the assessment fraud, how Granger's county office had been providing artificially low valuations, how those valuations were then used to justify the bank's loan decisions, how the loan terms themselves had been selectively altered in the bank's own records to create debts that didn't match the original agreements. He told them what he could do from his position. He had a minority interest, but he had allies on the bank's board who didn't know what was happening at the county level, and who, when presented with evidence, would have every reason to cooperate with a formal investigation rather than defend the people who had been running this scheme. He also told them something that Sophia hadn't known. "Thomas Granger has been in contact with a buyer," Levi said. There's a land acquisition company, I've been tracking it for 6 months, that has been purchasing distressed rural properties across 3 territories. The connection between that company and Granger's assessment office is what first drew my attention to this county. He paused. The plan, as best I can reconstruct it, was to drive enough ranches into foreclosure or forced sale to consolidate a significant portion of this county's agricultural land under a single buyer. At which point, the assembled property would be worth approximately 4 times what was paid for it. The room was silent. "They were planning to steal our land," Margaret Henderson said. Her voice was flat. "Not just one at a time as accidents. They were planning it from the beginning, all of it." "Yes." The word dropped in like a stone, into still water. And the silence that followed was the silence of people rearranging everything they thought they understood about the past several years of their lives. Tom Callahan's father pressed his shaking hands together. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Sophia watched the room. She watched the anger and the grief and the vindication moving through these people. The specific painful vindication of finding out that you were right, that something wrong was done to you, that you weren't inadequate or foolish or unlucky. You were deliberately targeted, and she felt something fierce and clear rise up in her chest. She had spent 2 years defending this ranch. 2 years being told directly and indirectly that she was too small, too inexperienced, too alone to hold on to what her father had built. And every one of those 2 years, while she'd been fighting to keep her head above water, the water had been rising on purpose. She was done. "What do we do first?" she asked. Levi looked at her. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I need to send a wire to Denver. Then we go to the bank." She didn't sleep that night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the night before. Less fear in it. More of something that felt, if she let herself call it what it was like, the particular alertness of the night before a fight you've decided you're going to win. She was at the kitchen table again before first light, but this time she wasn't going through her numbers. The numbers were done. She knew them cold. She was writing letters to each family who'd been at the meeting, confirming what had been discussed, confirming that they would bring their documentation to the bank on Friday. 5 days. She heard a sound from outside, not the ordinary sounds of the ranch, waking up something different, something that brought her to the window without quite knowing why. There was a rider coming up the long approach to her gate. It was not yet 6 in the morning. She was on the porch before the rider reached the gate, and she recognized the horse before she recognized the man on it. It was one of the bank's horses from their stable in town, a tall bay that Gerald Foss had ridden out on both his previous visits. But it wasn't Gerald Foss. It was Arthur Vance, and he was alone, and he was riding fast. And when he pulled up at her gate and saw her on the porch, something happened in his face that she couldn't entirely read. Urgency, and something underneath the urgency that looked almost like fear. "Miss Bennett." He didn't dismount. "I need to speak with you." "It's 6 in the morning, Mr. Vance." "I know." He glanced toward the barn, toward the bunkhouse. "Privately." "No." He blinked. "Anything you have to say to me," Sophia said, "you can say in front of my household. I don't have private conversations with men from your bank anymore." Another glance toward the barn. She could see him calculating something. "There's a problem," Vance said finally. "Granger knows about the meeting you held 3 nights ago. He has sources in the county. He knew by the following morning who was there and what was discussed." He paused. "He's moving up the timeline." Sophia went very still. "What timeline?" "The foreclosure filings. He planned to wait until next month, but he's filing on 3 properties by the end of this week. Henderson, Webb, and yours." Vance's voice had dropped. He looked like a man who had recently discovered that the weight of something was heavier than he'd calculated. "I'm not supposed to be here. I'm telling you because—" He stopped. "Because why?" "Because I have a father who ranched in Kansas," Arthur Vance said very quietly. "And what's being done to these people is wrong. I knew it was wrong, and I didn't say anything for long enough that I am not in a good position to claim the moral high ground. But there's still time if you move fast." Sophia stared at him. Then she turned her head. Levi was standing in the barn doorway. He'd heard every word. His face had gone very still in the way it did when he was calculating, not cold, never cold, but focused in a way that stripped everything else away. His eyes moved from Vance to Sophia, and she saw something in them sharpen. How long? His voice carried cleanly across the yard. Vance looked at him. And this time, there was no flicker of recognition, no small involuntary adjustment. Either Vance genuinely didn't know who Levi was, or he was an extraordinary actor. 3 days, Vance said. Maybe 4 if I'm wrong about the timeline. But I don't think I'm wrong. Sophia walked down the porch steps. She crossed the yard to where Levi stood, and she stopped next to him, and the two of them faced Arthur Vance together, and the morning light was coming up gray and cold, and she was not afraid. She was ready. "We moved today," she said. Levi looked at her. Just for a moment, just a fraction of a second, something moved across his face that was not strategy and not calculation. Something that was simply him looking at her and recognizing something. Then he nodded. "Then let's go." "Then let's go," Levi said, and Sophia was already moving back toward the house before the words finished leaving his mouth. She had 20 minutes to pull together everything she needed. She knew that without being told. She went straight to the lockbox, took out every document in it, the loan originals, the payment receipts, the 3 pages of notes from the night. She hadn't slept the business card Levi had handed her 4 days ago that she still hadn't decided what to do with, and she put them all into the leather folder with hands that were steady, because she made them steady. Fear was a luxury. Steady hands were a necessity. She heard Levi in the yard, his voice low and quick, talking to Danny, telling him to ride to the Henderson place and the Webb property and give them a single message: bring your papers and get to town by noon. Don't explain. Just come. She heard Danny ride out at a gallop without asking a single question, and she felt a surge of something sharp and grateful for a young man who understood when the moment called for action instead of words. She was back on the porch in 18 minutes, with the folder under her arm and her jaw set. Levi was waiting with 2 horses saddled. He'd changed his shirt. He still looked like a ranch hand. She'd wondered in the past 4 days whether he'd start to look different to her now that she knew what he was, whether the knowledge would change the image. It hadn't. He looked exactly the same. That was either a comfort or a warning, and she hadn't decided which. Arthur Vance had gone. He'd given them what he came to give, and ridden back toward town, and Sophia didn't know whether to trust him or not, but she didn't have the luxury of that question right now either. "Granger will know we're coming," she said, taking her horse's reins. "Yes." "Does that change anything?" Levi looked at her over the saddle. "It changes the order of what we do when we get there, not whether we go." He paused. "I sent the wire to Denver before first light this morning. I sent it last night actually after the meeting." He held her gaze. "I didn't wait to tell you. I should have." She absorbed that. He'd moved without telling her. Again. But this time, the moving was in the right direction, and this time he'd admitted it immediately, and she didn't have the time or the inclination to pick apart her own feelings about it at this particular moment. What did the wire say? It authorized my representative in Denver to contact the Territorial Banking Commissioner and request an emergency review of the First Territorial Bank of Harlan County. He swung up into the saddle. It also froze any transactions originating from Thomas Granger's account at our affiliate institution in Omaha. Sophia stared at him. "You can do that." "With cause, yes. I have cause." She mounted. They rode. The town of Harlan was 40 minutes at a steady pace, 25 at the pace they rode. Sophia had made this trip hundreds of times in her life, had ridden this road in every kind of weather and every kind of mood. But she had never ridden it the way she rode it now, with the folder against her ribs, and the cold morning air sharp in her lungs, and the particular sensation of moving towards something that was going to change whatever came after. Levi rode beside her without talking, and she was glad for that. She needed the silence to think. She was thinking about the foreclosure timeline Vance had given them. 3 properties by end of week. Hers, the Hendersons, Marcus Webb's. 3 families, 3 lives, 3 pieces of land that people had worked for decades, and somewhere in a bank office in town, a man named Granger was filing papers designed to make all of it vanish into a transaction that would look from the outside like the ordinary consequence of failing finances. She thought about Tom Callahan's elderly father pressing his shaking hands together at her table. Already gone. Already lost. She thought about Margaret Henderson, who had held her property through 3 years of calculated pressure, who had put her own papers on the table at that meeting, with the look of a woman who had been waiting for someone to tell her she wasn't wrong. She thought about her father, William Bennett, who had built this ranch on soil he'd broken himself, who had stood on that porch in the early mornings and looked out at it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had made something real, who had signed a loan agreement in good faith 11 years ago, with people who had already been planning even then to take it from him. She pressed her heels to the horse's flanks. They rode into Harlan at 8:30. The bank didn't open until 9. Sophia had known that and timed it deliberately. She did not want to be inside that building when it was locked and the staff hadn't arrived yet. She wanted witnesses. They tied the horses at the post outside the general store, and Sophia went in to buy coffee, not because she needed it, but because she needed something to do with her hands, and because she wanted the store owner, who was the most reliable transmitter of information in a 30-mile radius, to see her. To see them both. To know they were in town and walking toward the bank. The store owner, a wide-faced woman named Ruth Garner, who had known Sophia's father and had the specific quality of someone who had watched something unfair happening for a long time without knowing how to stop it. Looked at Sophia, and then at Levi, and then back at Sophia. "You going to the bank?" Ruth asked. Her voice was careful. "At 9, Sophia said. Ruth Garner set both coffees on the counter and wouldn't take Sophia's money. "I've been keeping track," she said quietly. "In my own ledger. What the assessment prices have been versus what I know things should be worth. I didn't know what to do with it." Sophia looked at her. "Keep it safe," she said. "We may need it." Ruth nodded and said nothing else, but her eyes followed them out with an expression that Sophia recognized as the look of someone who had been waiting for a long time for the right moment to act and was only now beginning to believe it might actually come. They stood outside in the cold morning with their coffee and waited. At 8:55, a man Sophia didn't recognize came out of the alley beside the bank, walked quickly to a horse tied at the far end of the street, and rode north at a pace that was not quite running but was close enough to catch Levi's attention. She saw him track the rider, his eyes following with that focused stillness. "Who's north of here?" he asked. "Granger's office is north." Her voice was flat. "County Land Records office." Levi was quiet for 2 seconds. "He knows we're here." "Yes." "How?" "Ruth Garner has a nephew who works at the bank." Levi looked at her. "I know," she said. "I know, but I didn't come here to be quiet about it." She handed him her empty cup. "I came here so he'd know I was coming." He stared at her for a moment, and then something happened on his face that she hadn't expected, something that was almost not quite a smile. The particular expression of a man who has just recalibrated his understanding of the person standing in front of him. "You want him scared?" Levi said. "I want him to make a mistake." The bank door opened at 9 o'clock exactly. They went in. The interior of the First Territorial Bank of Harlan County had the particular quality of a place designed to make a person feel smaller than they were. High ceilings. Heavy wood. The cashiers behind their windows with the careful, neutral expressions of people who had been trained to reveal nothing. Everything in the room communicated permanence and authority, which was the point. Sophia had been here dozens of times. It had always worked on her, even when she hadn't admitted it, that small involuntary diminishment that came with crossing the threshold. The way the room seemed to say, "This is where serious matters are decided by serious people, and you are a woman with muddy boots asking for something that may or may not be given to you." It didn't work today. She crossed the floor with her folder under her arm and went directly to the receptionist, a young man who had always looked slightly apologetic in her presence, as if he could sense that what was happening to her account was wrong and didn't know what to do about it. "I need to see the bank manager," Sophia said. "Not a representative, not Mr. Foss, the manager." Ma'am, Mr. Calloway doesn't usually. Tell him Sophia Bennett is here. Tell him I have documentation relating to fraudulent loan practices at this institution." She kept her voice even and clear. "And tell him I have a representative of Hunter Financial Group with me." The receptionist looked at Levi. He looked back at the young man with that steady, undramatic gaze and said nothing. Something happened in the receptionist's face. He stood up from his desk faster than she'd ever seen him move and went through the back door. She and Levi waited. They waited for exactly 4 minutes. She counted them. Then the back door opened, and the receptionist came out, and behind him came a man she'd only seen once. The bank's senior manager, Edward Calloway, who was 60 and silver-haired, and had always managed in the brief moments they'd interacted to treat her with the specific courtesy of a man who had made up his mind about a person and was being polite about it. He was not performing polite now. He was performing something more careful, more correct. His eyes went to Levi first, and Sophia watched it happen, the moment when a man who has been managing a situation from behind layers of insulation suddenly discovers the insulation may be thinner than he thought. "Miss Bennett." He extended his hand to her and she shook it. "Mr." He turned to Levi. "Hunter." Levi didn't put out his hand. A very small pause. "Of course. Please come back to my office." Calloway's office was large and carpeted, and had the kind of furniture that was meant to communicate stability and trust. He sat behind his desk, and Sophia and Levi sat across from him, and the folder was on the desk between them. And Sophia watched the manager's eyes go to it twice before he managed to look away. "I understand there's been a concern about the Bennett Ranch account," Calloway began. His tone was the tone of someone attempting to reduce the temperature of a situation that had already reached a temperature he couldn't control. "There's been a concern about fraud," Sophia said. "Specifically, the modification of loan terms in your institution's records to create debt obligations that don't match the original agreements signed by my father and witnessed by 2 parties in 1882. Additionally, a systematic pattern of artificially suppressed cattle assessments coordinated through the county land office, resulting in significant underpayment to this ranch and others in the county over a period of at least 3 years. She opened the folder. "I have documentation." She laid the papers out, methodically, one by one. Every payment receipt, the original loan document, her ledger records the comparison notes from the night. She hadn't slept the summary of assessment prices she'd cross-referenced against regional market rates. And then on top a second folder that Levi had passed to her this morning before they'd left, which she hadn't fully read, but which she knew contained the results of the investigation his company had been conducting for 8 months. Calloway looked at the papers. His face had gone very controlled. She'd seen that kind of control before in men who were calculating rapidly and trying not to show what they were finding. "Miss Bennett, the bank's records show." "Your records are wrong," she said. "Or they've been altered. Those are the only 2 possibilities, and I suspect you know which one it is." Silence. Levi leaned forward and placed one additional document on top of the pile. Sophia looked at it. It was a letter on heavy cream-colored paper, with a letterhead she recognized from the card he'd given her, Hunter Financial Group, Denver, Colorado. "That's a letter from my company to the Territorial Banking Commissioner's office," Levi said, "requesting an emergency audit of this institution's records, specifically the loan accounts and assessment documentation for the following ranches." He named 6 of them, including hers, without looking at notes. He had them memorized. "It was sent last night. They will have received it this morning." Edward Calloway looked at the letter. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Levi, and something happened in his face that was not just calculation anymore. It was the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the ground he's been standing on is not the ground he thought it was. "Mr. Hunter," he said slowly, "I wasn't aware that Hunter Financial had any interest in the account review," Levi said. "Yes, we've been conducting it for 8 months. I came here to understand the ground-level implementation." He paused. "I now understand it fully." Another silence. Longer this time. Sophia felt the moment shift. She'd been in enough tense conversations over the past 2 years with bank representatives, with buyers who tried to shortchange her, with neighbors who thought she should give up, to recognize when the power in a room changed direction. She felt it happening now, like a weather shift, like the way the air changed before a storm came in off the plains. Calloway was not the architect of what had been done to her. She was increasingly certain of that. He was a man who had looked away, who had been complicit by his refusal to ask questions, but he had not designed it. The design was Granger's, and Granger was not in this room. "Where is Thomas Granger?" she asked. Calloway's eyes moved to her. Something in them that she might have called relief, if that made any sense. The relief of a man who has been holding a secret so long that being asked about it directly was almost welcome. "I don't know," he said. "He left a message with his secretary this morning, said he'd be unavailable today." Levi stood up from his chair. Sophia watched him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform anything. He simply stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked at Calloway with an expression that was very quiet and very final. "I'm going to need access to your complete loan records for the past 5 years," he said. "Every account, every modification, every assessment record your institution received from the county office. I need it today." He paused. "Mr. Calloway, I want to be clear about what I'm telling you. This institution has been used to commit fraud against the people of this county. My company is one of its partial owners, which means my company has a legal and moral obligation to cooperate fully with the investigation that is now underway. The question you need to answer this morning is whether you personally are going to be someone who obstructs that investigation or someone who assists it." He let that sit for a moment. "I'd recommend assisting it." Calloway looked at him for a very long moment. "I'll have the records brought up," he said finally. While they waited, the Hendersons arrived. Sophia heard them before she saw them. Heard Margaret's voice in the outer office firm, and carrying, saying she was there to see about her accounts, and she was not going to wait. And then Marcus Webb's slower, deliberate footsteps, and the voice of the young man. Danny had ridden to fetch, who turned out to be the Webb's eldest son. James, 23 years old, and furious in the clean, righteous way of young men, who have just fully understood something that has been slowly destroying their family. Sophia went out to the outer office and brought them back. Calloway looked at 4 people arranged around his office with their documentation, and the expression of a man who had been hoping, perhaps, that this was a smaller problem than it was. It was not a smaller problem. Margaret Henderson put her papers on the desk. Marcus Webb put his papers on the desk. The pile grew, and each page that landed was another thread in something that was becoming too dense and too documented to dismiss. "There are 2 more families coming," Sophia said. "They'll be here within the hour." Calloway said nothing. He looked at the pile of papers. He looked at Levi. "The records you requested," he said, "will take some time to compile." "Then start now," Levi said. The first major revelation came 40 minutes later. One of Calloway's clerks, a young woman named Ellen, who had the look of someone who had been uncomfortable about something for a long time, and was experiencing the complicated relief of having it come into the open, brought in a ledger from the vault. Not the regular loan ledger. A second one. A ledger that was kept separately, that was not part of the standard filing system, that had been labeled in handwriting, that was not Calloway's, with a series of property numbers rather than names. When Levi opened it, he went very still. Sophia leaned over to look. What she saw was a parallel record, a complete, meticulous duplicate accounting system that tracked the same loans as the bank's official records, but with different numbers. Different interest rates. Different payment histories. Different assessed values. It was the mechanism. The entire mechanism documented in one book by the people who had built it. "He kept a record," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "He needed to." Levi's voice was equally quiet. "You can't run a scheme this complex without tracking it. You can't manipulate a dozen accounts simultaneously without writing down what you changed and what you told each owner versus what the real numbers were." He turned a page. "This is every account they touched, every property, every family." He looked up at her. "There's a name on the first page," he said. "The account identifier. Every entry in this ledger has an authorization initial." He turned it so she could see. The initials were T.G. Thomas Granger. Margaret Henderson, who had been standing beside Sophia and could see the ledger, made a sound that was not quite a word. a short, involuntary exhale like something physical had hit her. Marcus Webb leaned in, looked at the initials, and then straightened up and stared at the ceiling for a moment, with his jaw tight and his eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with weakness. Sophia put her hand flat on the open page of the ledger. She was thinking about all the times she'd been told the numbers were the numbers. That the bank's records were authoritative. That her own careful documentation was the work of an overconfident woman who didn't understand how these things worked. She was thinking about every conversation, every letter, every office visit where she had been made to feel like she was fighting windmills. The numbers had always been right. Her numbers. "I need this ledger protected," she said to Calloway. "I need it photographed or copied before it leaves this room, and I need it secured somewhere that Thomas Granger cannot access." She looked at the manager. "Can you do that?" Calloway looked at the ledger with the expression of a man staring at something he'd been hoping didn't exist. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I can do that." The second clerk went to work immediately. Sophia watched the pages being carefully copied one by one, and she felt the morning shifting around her into something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Momentum. It was Levi who first noticed that Calloway kept glancing toward the door. Not the door to the outer office, the side door, the one that led through a corridor to the back of the building. He'd been doing it since they'd opened the secondary ledger. Small, involuntary glances that he was clearly not aware he was making. Levi said nothing. He simply stood up and walked to the side door and opened it. The corridor beyond was empty, but at the far end of it, just barely visible, was the back exit, and through the narrow window beside it, Sophia could see a horse tied at the back post that had not been there when they arrived. She looked at Levi. He looked at her. "Who else is in this building?" he asked Calloway. His voice was very even. Calloway's jaw worked. "The regular staff." "Who else?" A pause. Very small. "But there. Gerald Foss came in through the back this morning," Calloway said. "About 20 minutes before you arrived." Levi turned to Sophia. She could see the calculation running behind his eyes, whether Foss was a threat, whether he was in communication with Granger, whether the horse at the back post meant something was about to happen or had already happened. "James," she said to the Webb boy, who straightened immediately, "go to the front of the building. Make sure we still have 2 horses at the post." James went without question. She turned to Margaret Henderson. "Stay with the documents. Don't let anyone take anything off that desk." Margaret's chin went up. "Nobody's taking anything." Sophia and Levi went through the side door. The corridor was short and dim, and their boots were quiet on the wood floor. She stayed just Levi's shoulder close enough to hear his breathing steady, controlled the breathing of a man who had been in difficult situations before, and the folder was still under her arm, because she was not setting it down in this building under any circumstances. The back room was a storage area. Filing cabinets, shelves of ledgers, the smell of paper and ink, and the particular damp quality of rooms that don't get much light. Gerald Foss was at the far cabinet. He had a leather satchel in one hand and was pulling files with the other, working quickly, and he didn't hear them until they were already in the room because he was too focused on what he was doing, and by then there was nowhere to go. He turned. His face when he saw them was the face of a man whose plan had just collapsed around him in a way he hadn't had time to prepare for. He stood with the files in his hand and the satchel half full and the back exit 10 feet away, and all of it was equally useless. "Mr. Foss." Sophia's voice was very calm. "What are you taking?" Foss looked at her. He looked at Levi. He looked at the back door. "Put the files back," Levi said. Not loudly, not threateningly, just with the absolute authority of someone who does not need volume to make a point. "All of them. Right now." Foss's hand tightened on the satchel for just a moment. Then the fight went out of him. She watched it happen, the specific visible collapse of a man who has been doing something wrong and has been caught and has just processed the full reality of the position he's in. His shoulders dropped. He set the files back on the cabinet with a hand that was not quite steady. "He told me to get them before anyone could look through them," Foss said. His voice was dull. "He said if the central files were missing, there was nothing to match the secondary ledger against." "Granger," Sophia said. He called me this morning, before the bank opened. Foss's eyes went to the floor. I've been doing what he told me for 3 years. I knew it was wrong. I've known for 2 years it was wrong, and I kept... He stopped, pressed his hand over his mouth for a moment. Where does it end? You do one wrong thing, and you do the next one, because you're already in it, and it never... He stopped again. The room was quiet. Sophia looked at this man, Gerald Foss, who had stood on her porch twice with his banker's manner and his calculated condescension, and delivered messages designed to make her afraid, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever. But something that recognized a man who had gotten into something he didn't know how to get out of, which was different from a man who had built the thing from the beginning. "Where is Granger?" she asked. Foss looked up. "He was at his office 2 hours ago. I don't know where he is now." A pause. "He has a property north of town, about 4 miles up the Garrison Road. He keeps horses there." Levi was already at the door. She went with him. She didn't ask whether she should, and he didn't suggest she shouldn't, which was the right call from both of them. They rode hard. The morning had turned cold and bright, the kind of clear Nebraska day that made everything look sharp and permanent, and the road north was empty except for them and the sound of hooves and the folder still under her arm, tucked inside her jacket now against the wind. 4 miles up the Garrison Road, there was a property. Small house, large stable, the look of a place that was less a home and more a staging point. And at the stable, hitched to a post and not yet fully tacked up, was a horse loaded with saddlebags that were fat with something. Sophia looked at the saddlebags. Levi looked at the house. The front door opened. Thomas Granger was 62 years old and had the look of a man who had spent his entire career in the business of assessing other people's things and deciding what they were worth. He was a compact, precise man. She'd seen him at county events, had shaken his hand, had thanked him for services. She now understood he had never been providing honestly. He was wearing his coat and his hat and carrying a travel bag. And when he saw them, his face went through several things very quickly before it settled on something that was trying to be composed. "Miss Bennett." His voice was careful. "What brings you out this way?" "I think you know," Sophia said. She dismounted. Levi stayed on his horse for a moment, then dismounted beside her, and the three of them stood in the cold, bright morning, and the thing between them was very clear, and nobody pretended it wasn't. "I don't know who you are," Granger said to Levi. But his voice when he said it had a quality that suggested he suspected. "My name is Levi Hunter." He paused. "Hunter Financial Group." Granger's composure held for exactly 2 more seconds. Then it broke. Not dramatically, not shouting or running, or any of the things that would have made it simple. It broke the way ice breaks when the temperature shifts, suddenly visible cracks spreading from a center point that had always been there. He looked at Levi with the expression of a man who has just understood that everything he built is standing on ground that no longer exists. "The secondary ledger is already in Callaway's safe," Sophia said. "It's been copied. There are 6 families in the bank right now with 3 years of documentation. And the banking commissioner's office in the territory received a formal review request this morning." She kept her voice even, because the evenness was the point. "There's nowhere for this to go that doesn't end the same way." Granger looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, she saw something in his face that was almost human. Not remorse exactly, but the look of a man confronting the full scale of something he'd built, seeing it from outside for the first time, and finding it larger and uglier than he'd been able to see from inside it. "You should have sold," he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't expected, something almost tired. "When Foss first came out, when the letters started, you should have sold. Everyone else was going to eventually. You were always going to be the hard one." "Yes," Sophia said. "I was." Granger reached into his coat. Levi moved faster than she'd expected, 1 step forward, and his hand on Granger's wrist before the motion could complete itself. What came out of the pocket was not a weapon. It was an envelope. Granger looked down at his own hand held by Levi's, and the fight that had been in him for those 2 seconds evaporated completely. "Documents," he said very quietly. "Some documents I was planning to..." He stopped. It doesn't. Levi took the envelope. He didn't open it yet. He kept his eyes on Granger. We're going back to town, Levi said. And you're going to talk to the banking commissioner's representative when they arrive. You're going to answer every question they have. Granger said nothing. Sophia looked at this man who had spent 3 years engineering the slow destruction of everything her father had built, who had sat in county offices and signed documents and coordinated with bankers and land buyers, while families lost what they'd spent their lives building. And she looked at him with her folder under her arm and her father's loan documents inside it, and she felt in that moment absolutely certain of something. She had been right. From the first letter, from the first number, that didn't match, from the first instinct that something was being done to her, and not just happening to her, she had been right. She turned back to her horse. "Ride behind us, Mr. Granger," she said, "and keep up." He rode behind them, all the way back to town. The afternoon that followed was the longest of Sophia's life, and also, in a way, she would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right words for one of the most necessary. The banking commissioner's emergency representative arrived by fast coach from the county seat at 2 in the afternoon, a thin, serious-faced man named Aldrich, who smelled of travel and had the manner of someone accustomed to arriving in difficult situations and finding them even more difficult than described. He spent 4 hours in Calloway's office with the secondary ledger and the family's documentation, and Granger, who had over the course of the afternoon said very little, but confirmed everything he was asked to confirm. The will to fight had left him somewhere on the Garrison Road and hadn't come back. Sophia sat in the bank's front office with Margaret Henderson and Marcus Webb and the others waiting. The waiting was its own kind of hard, the particular exhaustion of a body that has been running on urgency and is now required to be still while other people do the things that need doing. Margaret held her own hands in her lap. Marcus Webb had his eyes closed, but he wasn't sleeping. The Webb boy James kept standing up and sitting down. Levi came out of the back twice during those 4 hours. The first time to tell them the secondary ledger had been formally entered into the review record. The second time to tell them that Granger had confirmed the connection to the land acquisition company, had named names, had described the structure of the arrangement, had done it with the flat, depleted cooperation of a man who knew the game was finished. The second time he came out, he looked at Sophia. Just at her. For a moment, she looked back. There was too much to say, and this was not the place to say it, and both of them knew that. He went back inside. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Aldrich came out. He spoke quietly and carefully, with the manner of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say and was not going to diminish it by rushing. The preliminary review, he said, found substantial evidence of systemic loan fraud, falsified assessment records, and coordinated property manipulation, affecting at minimum 9 ranching families in the county. The bank's current management was suspended pending full investigation. Thomas Granger was being detained for formal questioning. He looked at the people in that room. "I want to be clear," Aldrich said, "that the investigation is still early. There are processes that must be followed. I cannot promise you a specific outcome or a specific timeline." He paused. "What I can tell you is that what you brought here today, the documentation, the record of payments, the cross-referenced assessment data, is exactly the kind of evidence that makes this kind of investigation viable. Without it, this would be significantly harder." He looked at Sophia. "I'm told you organized most of it." "We all brought pieces," Sophia said. "Yes, but someone put them together." She said nothing. Outside, the light had gone the color of old copper, and the day was done, and she was so tired she could feel it in her teeth. But underneath the tired was something that had not been there this morning, something that had been hollow for 2 years, and was not hollow anymore. Margaret Henderson leaned over and took her hand. Said nothing. Just held it. That was enough. Levi found her on the bank's front steps an hour later, when the offices had been locked and the families had gone home to think through what had happened and to sleep the kind of sleep that followed the end of something long. She was sitting on the top step with her folder in her lap and her eyes on the street, watching the last light go out of the day. He sat down beside her. Not close. Enough space that it was a choice to be near, not a presumption. They sat like that for a while. Foes turned over everything in the satchel, Levi said finally. The files he pulled this morning. It filled in some gaps in the assessment record that we'd been missing. Good. Another pause. The envelope Granger had. He set it on the folder in her lap. It was deeds, 6 of them. Properties he'd already arranged to transfer to the acquisition company. He paused. Yours wasn't one of them. He hadn't gotten to yours yet. She looked at the envelope without touching it. He thought he had more time, she said. Yes. The street was quiet now. Somewhere down the block, a lamp was lit in a window. She thought about her father standing at his kitchen table with a pen in his hand and a loan document in front of him, trusting in good faith that the institution across from him was what it said it was. She thought about 2 years of payments made carefully, and on time of receipts kept in a lockbox of numbers gone over and over in the lamplight, because something had never quite added up, and she had been too stubborn to let it go. You should have told me who you were, she said. I know. From the beginning, yes. He didn't try to soften it. I was wrong about that. I had reasons that seemed sound when I was in Denver looking at reports. When I was sitting at your table, they seemed less sound. She looked at him. His face in the fading light was the face she'd been reading for a month. The same lines, the same steadiness, the same quality of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. The fact of who he was had not changed that. It had added to it complicated. It made it harder to hold simply, but it had not made it false. The investigation, she said. When it's finished. What happens to the ranch? The manipulation of your loan records will be corrected. Your actual balance based on your documented payment history is substantially lower than what the bank has been claiming. He paused. Based on our calculations, you may owe nothing at all. The legal process will determine the exact figure. She stared at him. Nothing. You've been overpaying Sophia. Because they were applying payments to a balance that didn't exist. His voice was very even, but something underneath it wasn't. Your father's loan was nearly retired. You should have received a satisfaction notice 18 months ago. She put both hands on the folder in her lap. The street was quiet. The light was almost gone. She had fought for 2 years to hold on to a ranch she had already by any honest measure earned free and clear. She closed her eyes. She didn't cry. That wasn't what this was. What it was something older and deeper than tears. The feeling of setting down something very heavy that you have carried so long. You stopped noticing it was hurting you and feeling for the first time in longer than you can remember, the extraordinary relief of your own 2 hands being empty. After a while, Levi said very quietly, Are you all right? She opened her eyes. No, she said. Not yet. A pause. But I'm going to be. Not yet, Sophia said quietly, sitting on those bank steps with the last light dying around her. But I'm going to be. And she meant it in a way she hadn't meant anything in a long time, not as reassurance, not as performance, but as a fact she was making true in the moment of saying it. She stood up. She put the folder under her arm. She looked at Levi, who was watching her with the careful attention of a man who understood that what she needed right now was not comfort and not strategy, but simply to be seen accurately, and she said, I'm riding home. He nodded once and stood. I'll follow in the morning, he said. There are things I need to finish here tonight. She rode home alone through the dark, which was fine. She'd been riding this road alone for 2 years. She knew every curve of it, every place where the ground shifted under the horse's hooves, every sound the night made at this hour in this season. She rode with her folder in her jacket, and her hands easy on the reins, and something in her chest that was bruised and enormous, and underneath all of it, barely beginning to feel like relief. Old Pete was awake when she got back. He always was. He was sitting on the porch with his pipe, and he looked at her when she came in through the gate, and he read her face the way he always read her face, and what he said was, Well, we have them, Sophia said. Old Pete smoked his pipe for a moment. Your father would have liked to see that, he said. She unsaddled her horse. She went inside. She slept for 9 hours without waking once, which was the longest she'd slept in 2 years. Checking, The investigation moved fast once it started, which was not what Sophia had expected. She had braced herself for slowness, for the grinding pace of official processes, for delays and postponements, and the particular exhaustion of waiting on institutions to confirm what you already knew. She'd spent 2 years navigating exactly that kind of friction, and she had fully expected more of it. Instead, events accelerated in ways that felt almost vertiginous. By the end of the first week, the Territorial Banking Commissioner had assigned 2 investigators to Harlan County full-time. The secondary ledger Granger's meticulous damning record of every account he'd touched, every number he'd changed, every authorization he'd signed, turned out to be even more comprehensive than anyone had initially understood. It didn't just document the manipulation of 9 ranch accounts. It documented 41 transactions over 4 years involving 14 properties, a land acquisition company registered under a name that traced back through 2 intermediary companies to a business partner of Granger's who lived in Omaha and had never set foot in Harlan County in his life. The scale of it, when it became clear, was the thing that changed the room wherever it was presented. It wasn't opportunism. It wasn't a bank that had gotten greedy in a small local way. It was a coordinated scheme with outside financing and a planned exit designed to collapse the local land market, deliberately acquire the distressed properties at pennies on their real value, and consolidate them into an agricultural holding large enough to sell to railroad interest at an enormous profit. Sophia learned this in pieces over days from Levi, who came back to the ranch on the second morning and resumed working simply without fanfare, as if that were the most natural thing, while also spending evenings at her kitchen table, going through updates from the investigators and his own company's legal representatives who had arrived from Denver by the end of the first week. She watched him move between those 2 roles without apparent friction and found herself gradually less troubled by it than she'd expected to be. A man could be 2 things. She had always known that. She was the daughter of a rancher and the sole operator of a working ranch, and the woman who had just dismantled a 4-year financial fraud. She was at least 3 things herself. What mattered was whether the things were honest. She was still deciding that, but she was deciding it fairly. On the 8th day, one of Levi's lawyers, a precise young man named Carver, who wore his suit like armor and spoke in complete, exact sentences, came to her kitchen with a document she hadn't expected. "This is the corrected loan balance," Carver said, setting it in front of her. "Based on your documented payment history applied to the actual terms of the original 1882 agreement, with no compounding interest, no false penalties." Sophia looked at the number at the bottom of the page. $47. She read it again. $47. "That's what you owe," Carver said in the same tone he might use to describe the weather. "The remaining balance after correctly applied payments. $47.11. The kitchen was very quiet. "My father took out a loan of $1,200, Sophia said slowly, "and made payments for 9 years, and you've made payments for 2 more, at the actual contracted rate." Carver folded his hands. "The balance the bank was claiming, the one on the letters you received, reflected 4 years of fabricated penalties and manipulated interest calculations. None of it was real." Sophia put both hands flat on the table. She thought about the shotgun she'd pointed at Gerald Foss on this porch. She thought about the nights at this table going over numbers that never came right, because they had never been right. She thought about her father's handwriting on those receipts, careful and consistent. The handwriting of a man who kept his obligations because keeping your obligations was what a person did. "I want to pay it," she said. Carver blinked. "I beg your pardon. The $47. Her voice was steady. "I want to pay it, today. And I want a satisfaction notice in my father's name." Carver looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. The armor came down very briefly, and underneath it was a man who understood exactly what she was asking and why. "I'll have it drawn up by this afternoon," he said. The satisfaction notice arrived at 4 o'clock. It was a single page. Official letterhead. The bank's seal under the emergency management that had replaced Callaway's suspended administration. And at the top, in the formal language of financial institutions, "Satisfaction of loan. Original agreement, dated March 14, 1882. issued to the estate of William James Bennett, her father's name. She held it for a long time, standing at the kitchen table alone because she'd sent Carver away and the hands were out on the property and the house was quiet. Just her and the paper, and her father's name printed in black ink on a page that said in the language of law and money that what he had built was paid for and belonged to them and could not be taken. She put it in the lockbox. She closed the lid. She pressed her hand on top of it for a moment, the way you might press your hand on the shoulder of someone you loved. "There," she said out loud, to him, to the room, to whoever was listening. "There, Pa." Then she went back to work because the ranch didn't stop for grief or for victory or for anything, and because that was what her father had taught her, and because she was above all things her father's daughter. The second major twist came on the 11th day, and it came from a direction nobody had anticipated. Arthur Vance walked into the bank, the one who had ridden to her ranch before dawn with his warning, who had the father who'd ranched in Kansas, and he asked to speak to the investigators. Not under pressure, not after being summoned. He walked in of his own accord, and he sat down, and he spent 3 hours talking. What he told them filled in the piece of the story that had still been missing. Granger had not acted alone inside the bank. But it wasn't Calloway. Calloway had genuinely not known the full scope of it, had looked away in ways that made him culpable for negligence, but not for the scheme itself. The person inside the bank who had actively participated, who had facilitated the record alterations, who had known what the secondary ledger was and had helped maintain access to it, was Gerald Foss, which was not surprising. Sophia had suspected it the moment she'd found him in the storage room. What was surprising was what Vance also revealed about himself. He had not just warned Sophia out of a belated conscience. He had been for 8 months quietly documenting the irregularities he observed, keeping his own parallel records stored off-site in a ledger he kept at his boarding house because he had been trying to build the nerve to do something with it and hadn't yet found it. His ledger. It turned out contained documentation of 3 specific transactions that weren't in Granger's secondary ledger at all. 3 earlier transactions from the first phase of the scheme, before Granger's record-keeping system had been fully developed. Those 3 transactions were the ones that directly tied the Omaha business partner to the original fraud, the link that closed the circuit between Harlan County and the outside money that had funded the whole operation. Vance's ledger was the final piece. When Levi told her this at the kitchen table on the evening of the 11th day, Sophia was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid," she said. "Yes." He knew what they were doing, and he kept records because he knew it was wrong, but he was too afraid to come forward until there was no other option. Yes, she thought about that, about fear and the things it cost people, not just the things it let happen, but the things it took from the person doing the being afraid. Arthur Vance had spent 8 months with a ledger at his boarding house and the knowledge of a wrong. He wasn't brave enough to stop, and she suspected those 8 months had cost him more than he'd ever be able to account for. "He did come forward," she said finally. "He did." "Then that counts for something." Levi looked at her. "It does." The investigators, when they heard her position that Vance's cooperation had been voluntary and had provided the essential link in the case, weighed it and gave him the consideration it deserved. Not immunity. Accountability for his knowing participation in the irregular reporting, which was real. But the difference between a man who walked in on his own and handed over evidence and a man who had to be found. Sophia didn't know whether that was justice exactly. She knew it was the closest thing available, and she had learned in the past 11 days to work with what was available. On the 14th day, the investigators held a formal meeting with all the affected families. They gathered in the largest room the Harlan County Courthouse had, which wasn't very large, and people stood along the walls and sat on borrowed chairs, and the web boy. James stood in the back with his arms folded and his jaw tight, which was how he apparently processed most things. The lead investigator, a man named Hartley, who had done this kind of work for 17 years and had the manner of someone who no longer found it possible to be surprised, but had not stopped caring about the outcome, laid out what the investigation had established. The fraud, its scope, its mechanisms, its intended outcome. The names attached to it. Granger Foss, the Omaha. partnered two additional figures at the land acquisition company, who had not yet been located but whose identities were known. And then what came next? Every falsified loan balance would be corrected. Every family that had been making payments against fabricated debt would receive a full accounting of their actual position. Families whose properties had been taken through fraudulent foreclosure proceedings. The Callahans were entitled to pursue compensation through the formal claims process that the commissioner's office was establishing. He said that last part carefully. The way people said things that were true but complicated because compensation and restoration were not the same thing, and a piece of land that had been sold was not the same as a piece of land that was yours, and everyone in that room understood the difference. Tom Callahan's father, who had come again driven again by his grandson, sitting in a chair that James Webb had specifically gone and found for him, listened to all of it without expression. When Hartley finished, the old man raised one hand slightly. "Can I get my land back?" he said. "Or just money?" The room was very still. Hartley paused. Mr. Callahan, the property was sold to a private buyer in a transaction that, while initiated through fraudulent means, involved a buyer who may be considered an innocent party. The legal determination of whether the sale itself can be voided is, "I don't need the legal language," the old man said. "I need to know if my family's land is coming back." Hartley was quiet for a moment. "That's not certain," he said. "I'm sorry." The old man nodded once and said nothing else. He sat with his hands in his lap for the rest of the meeting, and nobody looked directly at him because what was on his face was too private for a public room. Sophia looked at her own hands. She thought about the $47, about the satisfaction notice in her lockbox with her father's name on it, about the thing she had that the Callahans no longer had, which was the land itself, still hers, still standing. After the meeting, she went to the old man. She sat down next to him in the chair that James Webb had found, and she didn't say anything about the land, because there was nothing to say about it that wasn't inadequate. She just sat there. After a while he said, "Your father was a good man." "Yes," she said. "He would have fought this the same way you did." "I know." Another pause. "Do you want the records?" she asked. "Whatever we have from the investigation, the documentation that shows what was done to your family. I can make sure you get copies of all of it." He looked at her. "What good does it do me?" "It tells the truth," she said. "About what happened. About why you had to sell. About the fact that it wasn't your failure." She paused. "Your grandchildren will want to know that someday." The old man was quiet for a long time. "Yes," he said finally. "I want the records." She squeezed his hand once and stood and went to find Carver to arrange it. Outside the courthouse. Levi was waiting. He'd been in the meeting along the wall with his arms at his sides and his face neutral, the way he stood when he was processing something and didn't want the processing visible. He fell into step beside her as she came down the courthouse steps, and they walked without deciding to walk together, which was simply what happened now, a pattern that had developed without either of them naming it. "The Callahan land," she said. "I know. Is there anything?" "I'm looking into it." His voice was careful. "The buyer may be open to negotiation. I don't know yet. I'm not going to promise anything I can't deliver." She appreciated that. She had always appreciated that about him, the specific quality of a man who did not tell you what you wanted to hear when he wasn't sure it was true. "How much longer?" she asked. "For the investigation. For the official pieces." "Hartley thinks 6 to 8 weeks for the full report. The criminal referrals for Granger and Foss are already moving. The Omaha partner." He paused. "That's a longer timeline. The attorneys are working it." She nodded. They walked. After a while, without particularly planning it, they were at the edge of town where the road turned north toward her ranch, and the afternoon light was doing that thing it did in October, where it went amber and sideways and made everything look slightly more significant than it was. Levi stopped. She stopped. He looked at her with the steady gray gaze she had first read across a dark porch 5 weeks ago when he was a stranger asking for work, and she was a woman with a revolver and a lockbox full of receipts and no idea what was coming. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. When this is finished, the official parts, I'll be going back to Denver. There are things at the company that have to be attended to in person. He paused. But I want to come back. She looked at him. To work the ranch. The question was direct. She meant it to be. If you'll have me. He held her gaze. Not as an investigator. Not with an agenda. Just. He stopped. And for the first time in 5 weeks, Levi Hunter, who was always measured, who never showed his full hand before he was ready, looked at her with an expression that had nothing measured in it at all. I'd like to know what it is when it's real. The afternoon light held everything very still. She thought about trust, which was the only currency that actually mattered in any of this. She thought about what it had cost her to build it toward him, and what it had cost her to have it complicated, and what it would cost her to decide now whether the thing she'd built was still intact, or whether the complication had broken it. She thought about sitting at her kitchen table every week going over numbers with a man who asked what she thought, and listened to the answer. She thought about him stepping in front of her hand when Granger reached into his coat. Fast, instinctive, the body's decision before the mind's, which told you something true about a person. She thought about the way he'd said that first morning on the porch with his hat in his hands. Just a bed in the bunkhouse and honest wages. He hadn't lied about wanting honest work. He'd lied about why. She could work with the why. She was less certain she could work with a man who lied about the wanting. You can come back, she said. Her voice was even. But we do this honestly. All of it. If I ask you a question, you answer it. Yes. If there's something I should know, you tell me before it matters instead of after. Yes. And you work the ranch like a ranch hand because I'm not running a company. I'm running a piece of land and it requires real work from everyone on it. Something moved across his face that she had learned by now to read as the expression he made when he was trying not to let something show and not quite managing. I know how to work a ranch, he said. I know you do. She picked up the folder she'd carried out of the courthouse. 6 weeks then. Maybe 8. After that. She turned back toward the road. After 3 steps, she heard him exhale slowly. Long, the sound of a man who had been holding something tightly for a long time and had just been given permission to set it down. She did not look back. But the corner of her mouth moved very slightly in a direction she was glad he couldn't see. The weeks that followed had the quality of things settling after a long disruption, the way land looked after a storm moved through, changed but recognizable, the familiar shapes reasserting themselves through the freshness of turned-over earth. The ranch ran. The cattle were moved. The horses were exercised. Danny asked fewer questions of Levi, who was still there through the first week, and more of old Pete, who bore this shift with his usual wordless patience. Ruth Garner, at the general store, had taken to keeping what she called her community ledger openly on the counter. Now a running record of local cattle prices that 3 other business owners had contributed to making the kind of comparison that had always been possible and had simply required someone to start the habit. Sophia rode the north fence line on a Tuesday. Her father's favorite stretch, the backbone of the ranch. She rode it slowly the way you did when you were looking at something rather than moving through it, and she let herself do something she hadn't done in 2 years, which was to feel proud, not triumphant, not relieved. Proud in the simple and ordinary sense of a person who had done a hard thing the right way and was allowed to know it. The letter from the commissioner's office arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 14 days after the courthouse meeting. She opened it at the kitchen table. Carver was there. He'd become a fixture at this table, which she'd stopped finding strange, and he read it alongside her and did not speak until she'd finished. The criminal referrals for Thomas Granger and Gerald Foss had been formally submitted to the territorial court. Granger's assets had been frozen pending the outcome. The Omaha partner, whose name was Raymond Stroud, had been located in Chicago and was in the process of being extradited. And at the bottom of the letter, a single paragraph that Carver pointed to without speaking. The land acquisition company had agreed to enter into negotiations regarding 3 properties that had been acquired through the fraudulent scheme. The Callahan family's property was one of them. Sophia read that paragraph twice. Then she looked at Carver. How? Mr. Hunter, Carver said simply. He contacted the acquisition company's principal investor directly. It turns out the investor had no knowledge of how the properties had been assembled. When presented with the evidence, Carver allowed himself a small pause. He was not eager to be associated with fraud, particularly when Mr. Hunter made clear that the documentation made that association inevitable if he chose not to cooperate. Sophia sat back in her chair. Levi had done it quietly, without telling her he was doing it, which she might have objected to on grounds of being asked first, except that in this case, she couldn't quite bring herself to object because what he'd done was try to give an old man his land back. She was going to have a conversation with him about the telling her first part, but not until after she rode over to the Callahan place. She went that same afternoon. She didn't prepare what she was going to say because there wasn't a prepared version of this. There was just the riding and the arriving, and the old man who came to his door and looked at her and said nothing. She handed him the letter. He read slowly. His hands were steadier today than they'd been at the courthouse. She watched his eyes move down the page, watched the moment they reached the final paragraph, watched the very small thing that happened in his face, so small that if she hadn't been looking directly at him, she might have missed it. He looked up. "It's negotiations," she said. "Not certain. But it started." He nodded. He handed the letter back. She didn't take it. "That's yours," she said. "Keep it." He looked at the letter in his hand for a moment. Then Tom Callahan's eldest grandson, 8 years old, gap-toothed, the one who'd been driving the old man to meetings, came barreling through the door and stopped short when he saw Sophia and looked at his grandfather's face, and even at 8 years old, clearly understood that something significant had just happened. "Grandpa." His voice was uncertain. The old man looked at the boy, and then for the first time since Sophia had met him, Tom Callahan's father smiled. It was a small smile worn in around the edges, the smile of a man who hadn't used it in a while and was finding it still worked. He put his hand on the boy's head. "Go tell your father," he said quietly, "to come inside." Sophia rode home. The sky was going orange, and the road was familiar under her horse's hooves, and she was thinking about things that couldn't be fixed and things that could, and the long, imperfect, necessary work of telling the difference between them. She was thinking about her father's satisfaction notice in the lockbox. She was thinking about Margaret Henderson, who had called on her 2 days ago just to sit at the kitchen table and talk the way women did when the crisis had passed, and the ordinary loneliness of being strong alone was once again the thing that needed tending. She was thinking about Levi Hunter, 600 miles away in Denver, attending to things at a company that operated across 6 territories, sitting behind a desk that was the opposite of a bunkhouse. She was thinking about what he'd said. "I'd like to know what it is when it's real." She crested the last rise before the ranch gate and pulled her horse up for a moment, the way her father always had the place where you could see the whole property at once, the way it spread out below you in the late light. Her land. Paid for. Documented. Defended. Hers. She pressed her heels to the horse's flanks and rode down. She pressed her heels to the horse's flanks and rode down toward everything that was hers. And for the first time in 2 years, that word landed without the weight of a fight behind it. The ranch was quiet when she got back. The good kind of quiet, the kind that meant everything was where it was supposed to be. Old Pete had the evening feeding done. Danny had latched the barn. The horses were settled. She unsaddled her own horse the way she always did. She'd never handed that off to anyone, never would, and she stood in the barn for a moment in the dark, and the smell of hay and animals, and the ordinary end of a day, and she let herself feel the full shape of what the past 6 weeks had been. Then she went inside and made supper, and sat at the kitchen table alone, and was for the first time in longer than she could remember, not afraid of what the morning would bring. The letter from Denver came on a Wednesday. Not official paper, this time, not legal language, not Carver's precise handwriting. Just a plain envelope, her name on the front in handwriting. She recognized clean and exact the kind that had once told her more about a man than he'd intended. She opened it at the table with her coffee going warm in her hands. It was short. 3 paragraphs. She read them twice, not because they were complicated, but because she wanted to read them the right way, which was slowly without deciding what she thought before she'd finished. He wrote that the company matters were settled for now, that the criminal proceedings were moving as they should, that Raymond Stroud had been formally charged in Chicago and the extradition was complete, that Granger's trial date had been set for February. He wrote that the Callahan negotiation had concluded. The acquisition company had agreed to a buyback at the original fraudulent sale price, not full market value, not full justice, but the land back in the family's name, which was the part that mattered. And then, in the third paragraph, in the same plain and direct way, he did everything he wrote that he intended to come back to Harlan County at the end of the month, if she was still willing, and that he understood if circumstances or time or her own judgment had shifted, and that he wanted her to know whatever she decided that the weeks he had spent working her ranch had been the most honest he'd lived in years. That he didn't say that to ask anything of her. He said it because it was true, and she deserved to know it was true. He signed it simply Levi. She folded the letter and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she got up, went to her writing desk, and wrote back. Her response was also short. 2 sentences. The ranch could use the help. Come when you're ready. She sent it that afternoon. He arrived on a Friday 23 days after the letter. Not in a company coach, not with luggage that announced anything about who he was. He rode in on his own horse, a different one than before, a gray that moved well with his worn saddlebag and his hat, and the same quality she'd seen the first morning he appeared on her porch, which was a man carrying only what he needed. Danny saw him first and came to find Sophia in the west pasture, where she was checking the fence line, and reported the arrival with the studied casualness of a young man who had opinions about the situation and was trying to keep them to himself. "The manhunter's back," Danny said. "I know," Sophia said without looking up from the fence post she was examining. "Tell him to put his horse in the bay stall and check the water trough on the north side. It's been running slow." Danny blinked. Then he grinned, which he covered badly, and rode back. She finished the fence line and came in at the same time she always did. Levi was at the water trough. He'd found the blockage a collapsed fitting the same kind that had needed replacing twice in the past year, and he had his sleeves rolled and his hands in it, and he looked up when she came around the corner with the particular expression of a man who is trying to read a situation accurately and not assume. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Fitting's cracked," he said. "Same place as before. You need a new one." "I know," she said. "There's a replacement in the barn, second shelf left side." He went and got it without another word. She watched him work and felt something that was not simple. Feelings about Levi Hunter were never going to be simple. She'd accepted that, but was underneath its complexity, honest. He was here. He'd come back the way he said he would. He was fixing her water trough. That was a start. She'd built everything she had from starts. The first real conversation happened that evening after supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, and she poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and sat down across the table, the way they'd sat across from each other a dozen times before. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. "How are the Hendersons?" he asked. It was exactly the right question to ask first, and she thought he knew it was the right question, which was why he asked it. Not starting with himself. Starting with the people the whole thing had been about. "Margaret got her corrected loan statement last week," Sophia said. "She's been overpaying for 3 years, same as me. The refund isn't enough to make up for the fear, but she's not losing the property, and she knows that now." She paused. "She cried when she told me. She said she hadn't cried through any of it until then, that the crying came when it was safe." Levi nodded slowly. He understood something about that. She could see it. "Marcus Webb. His son James is taking over more of the management. Marcus told me last week he thinks it might be time to let the boy run it. He said he didn't know if he was ready to step back, but he thought maybe the fighting had taken more out of him than he'd admitted." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "He said he was grateful. He wanted me to tell you that." Levi was quiet. "He should have told me himself," he said finally. "He would have." She met his eyes. "Give him time." They sat with that for a moment. "The Callahan land," she said. "It's done. It's done. The deed transferred back to the family name last week. Tom's son is moving the family back onto the property next month. He paused. The house needs work. 3 years of other people not caring for it. They'll care for it. Yes, Levi said. They will. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them threw the same light it always had, and the kitchen was the same kitchen, and the table was the same table where they'd spent so many evenings building the case that had changed the county. Nothing about the room was different. Everything about what sat between them was. I need to ask you something, she said. And I need you to answer it the same way you've been answering things since that morning on the courthouse steps. Straight. Ask. When you came here the first time, before you knew me, before the ledgers and the investigators and all of it. She held his gaze. Did you know my ranch was going to be all right? Did you come here already knowing I'd have enough to keep it? He didn't answer immediately. She'd learned that his pauses were not evasions, they were the time he took to make sure what he said was actually true. I knew your documentation was stronger than anyone the bank had targeted, he said carefully. I knew from the records my people pulled that you had receipts nobody else had kept, that you were on paper the best positioned of all of them to fight this. Another pause. But I didn't know you were going to be all right. I hoped it. I came here partly because of it. He looked at her steadily. I didn't know you were going to be you. The kitchen was very quiet. What does that mean? Her voice was even. It means I read a file on the Bennett Ranch before I came here. Numbers, land records, loan history. His jaw moved slightly. And then I watched you point a folder of evidence at a bank manager and tell him his numbers were wrong, and I watched you ride across this county in 3 days to bring 6 families together around a problem they'd all been told was their own personal failure. And I... He stopped, pressed his hands flat on the table for a moment. I have run a company for 12 years. I have been in rooms with very capable people doing very difficult things. And you are the most... He stopped again. She waited. I am not very good at this part, he said. I know, she said. Keep going anyway. He looked at her with an expression that was stripped entirely of the measured quality he usually maintained, and what was underneath it was just a man looking at a woman across a kitchen table trying to say something true. You made me want to be honest, he said. That's the simplest version. From the first week, every day I came to that table and sat across from you, I was more ashamed of what I hadn't told you. Not because it was strategically wrong, because it was wrong, and you deserved better, and I knew it, and I kept choosing the investigation over the honesty, and I... He exhaled slowly. I am sorry for that. I've told you that before. I want to tell you again. She held his gaze. She thought about what it had felt like to see that business card. To read Hunter Financial Group, Denver, Colorado, and feel the floor change beneath her. To sit alone at this table that night and try to decide what was real. She had decided eventually that most of it was. Not all of it had been done the right way, but most of it had been real. I accept that, she said. Something moved through him that was visible even with his stillness. Now, she said, picking up her coffee cup. I want to talk about the water trough fitting because that's the 3rd time in 2 years, and I think the problem is the pipe underneath, not the fitting itself. A beat. Then Levi Hunter laughed. Not a performed laugh, not a polite one. An actual laugh, surprised out of him. The laugh of a man who had been braced for something very heavy, and found instead something that was human and ordinary and manageable. She looked at him over her coffee cup, with her expression exactly as neutral as she intended. The pipe, he said, getting himself back. 3rd shelf in the barn. There's a length of copper pipe I bought 6 months ago and never got to. I'll look at it tomorrow. Good. October moved into November the way it did in Nebraska, not gradually but decisively, as if the season had made a choice and committed to it. The work of the ranch changed with it the way it always did. Different rhythms, different demands, the particular winter preparation that required every hand to be where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Levi was where he was supposed to be. He worked the way he'd worked the first time, with the same unhurried competence, the same quality of attention that made the work go right. Old Pete, who had withheld judgment the first time around with characteristic patience, now extended the sort of wordless acceptance that was the closest he got to warmth which was worth considerably more than most people's warmth. Danny had graduated from following Levi around with questions to asking them only when something genuinely stumped him, which was its own kind of progress. The evenings at the kitchen table continued, but they were different now. Not the focused urge of building a case, not the careful navigation of two people finding the edges of what they could trust each other with. More ordinary than that. More like the kind of conversation that happened between two people who had stopped performing for each other and were simply talking. He told her about the company, not impressively, not as a man establishing his importance, but the way people talked about their work when they were tired and had a cup of coffee and didn't need to be anything other than what they were. He told her about the two men he'd sent to investigate first, and how one of them had come back and told him the situation on the ground was worse than the reports showed, and how that had been the moment he'd decided to come himself. He told her about a decision he'd made 8 years ago that had turned out wrong, and how it had taken him 3 years to fully understand why and what he'd done differently since. She told him about her father. Not the version of her father that existed in other people's stories, the legend of William Bennett, the man who'd built the ranch, the respected rancher, but the actual man, who had been stubborn about the wrong things sometimes, and right about the important things almost always, who had taught her to keep receipts because he'd been burned once by not keeping them 20 years before she was born, and had never forgotten it, who had told her when she was 12 years old and had just lost a calf and was devastated by it that the land would take things from you, and the only answer to that was to keep building anyway, because the land didn't take things to hurt you. It just took them, because that was what land did, and you were either a person who built anyway, or you weren't, and the Bennetts had always been people who built. He sounds like someone I would have liked, Levi said. He would have put you through your paces, she said. He would have asked you hard questions and watched how you answered them and not told you what he thought until he was certain. That sounds familiar. She looked at him. It should. The corner of his mouth moved. The twist that she hadn't seen coming arrived by wire on a Thursday morning in November, 6 weeks after Levi came back. It was from Carver, 3 lines. Granger's defense attorney had filed a motion to dismiss on the grounds that the secondary ledger, the crucial document, the spine of the entire case, had been obtained improperly, as it had been removed from a secured bank vault during a period when the bank's standard management was under suspension. The motion argued that the document was inadmissible. Sophia read the wire. She read it again. Then she walked to the barn, where Levi was replacing the water pipe, with the competent efficiency of a man who had promised to do something and was doing it, and she handed him the wire without a word. He read it. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but she'd learned to read the small changes, the very slight tightening around his jaw, the particular quality of stillness that meant he was thinking fast and not going to speak until he'd finished. He handed the wire back. "Carver already knows," he asked. "He sent it." "Then he's already working on the response." He paused. The ledger wasn't removed. It was secured in place by the bank's emergency management, which had full legal authority during the suspension. Calloway authorized the copy, not the removal. The original never left the vault. She stared at him. "That's the answer. That's the answer." His voice was certain. "It's a weak motion. It was filed because it's the only thing the defense has, which tells you how strong the rest of the case is." He met her eyes. "Carver will know how to address it. This doesn't change the outcome." She looked at the wire in her hand. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She wasn't quite. She'd been certain things were settled before, and found new complications arriving, but she trusted the certainty in his voice, which was specific and informed, not reassuring. He wasn't telling her it was fine to make her feel better. He was telling her because he knew. She sent a reply to Carver asking for a full briefing. The motion was denied 10 days later. Granger's trial began in February. Sophia testified on the second day. She had been prepared for this, had spent time with Carver going through what to say and how to say it. But no amount of preparation quite accounted for the specific quality of sitting in a formal proceeding and saying out loud in front of a judge and a gallery, and the man himself, exactly what had been done and who had done it and what it had cost. She was in the witness chair for 3 hours. She answered every question directly. She did not elaborate beyond what was asked. She did not look at Granger more than once, and when she did look at him, she did it the way she looked at things. She needed to assess accurately without emotion, getting in the way of seeing clearly. He looked older than she remembered. Not broken, not remorseful, but smaller in the way people became smaller when the structure they'd built around themselves was gone. When she stepped down from the stand, she walked past the gallery, and Levi was there 3 rows back, and he looked at her with an expression she'd seen exactly once before on the courthouse steps. The evening the investigation began when he'd looked at her the way a man looked at something he was trying to memorize. She gave him a small nod and kept walking. Thomas Granger was found guilty on all charges in the first week of March. Gerald Foss pleaded to a lesser count and received a reduced sentence in exchange for his full testimony. Raymond Stroud in Chicago was awaiting his own proceedings. The verdict came by wire because Sophia had not gone back to town for the decision. She'd made her testimony, and she'd done her part, and she'd come home to her ranch and her animals and her fence line, because that was where she belonged, and that was what needed tending, and the verdict would come when it came. She was in the kitchen when the wire arrived. Carver's boy brought it out personally, which told her before she opened it which direction it had gone. She read it once. She went to the front porch. She stood there for a long time looking out at the land in the early March light, still cold, still hard in places, but with that particular quality that Nebraska land got in late winter, when you knew the turning was coming, even if it wasn't here yet. She heard boots behind her. Levi came and stood beside her. He'd read the wire she'd left it on the table, and he'd know what Carver's boy coming meant. They stood there together without speaking for a while, which was something they'd gotten good at. "It's done," she said finally. "Yes." She thought about her father's name on the satisfaction notice in the lockbox. About Tom Callahan's father holding the letter about his land, with hands that were steadier than they'd been the day before. About Margaret Henderson saying the crying came when it was safe. About a county that had been quietly robbed for 4 years, beginning to understand that what had happened to them was not their failure, and never had been. "My father would have wanted to know," she said quietly, "that it came right, that we kept it." Levi was quiet for a moment. "Tell him," he said simply. She looked at him. He looked back, steady as always, present as always. Exactly himself, which was the thing she had learned over the months of knowing him was the rarest quality a person could have. She turned back to the land. She thought about what she wanted to say, and whether she could say it right, and then decided that right wasn't the standard she needed to meet. Honest was the standard. "I trusted you when I thought you had nothing," she said. He was very still beside her. "I know. I want you to know that part hasn't changed." She paused. "What I trusted then, the part of you that showed up and worked and asked what I thought and listened to the answer that wasn't a lie. I know that now." She kept her eyes on the land. "The rest of it was wrong. The not telling was wrong. But that part was real." He exhaled, long and slow the way he had on the courthouse steps. "It was the most real I'd been in a long time," he said. "I didn't know that until I was in it. I knew it by the second week, and I used the investigation as a reason not to say so, and that was—" He stopped. "That was a kind of cowardice. I've done harder things than that conversation should have been." "Yes," she said. "You should have." A pause. "I know." She let that sit. Then she said, "I'm not asking you to stay forever. I'm not asking for anything you haven't offered. But I want you to understand something." She turned and looked at him directly. "This ranch is mine. It will always be mine. Not because you helped save it, not because of the investigation. It was mine before you got here, and it will be mine long after whatever this is has become, whatever it becomes. I need you to know that before anything else." He met her eyes without flinching. "I know it," he said. "I knew it the day I rode in. I've never thought of it as anything other than yours." She believed him. She realized, believed him for a while. "All right," she said. She turned back to the land. Beside her, he turned too. They stood there together in the March cold, with the whole ranch spread out in front of them, the fence lines her father had built, the barn where she'd unsaddled horses alone for 2 years, the gate where a man had arrived one morning with his hat in his hands, asking only for honest work, and the land held all of it without comment. The way land always did, patient and permanent and indifferent to the smallness of any single story told on top of it. But the story was not small. It was the story of a woman who had kept every receipt added, every number refused, every invitation to believe she was wrong, who had stood in front of a man in a suit with a shotgun she hadn't used in 3 years and said, "Get off my land," with a voice that didn't shake, not even a little, and had meant it, and had proven it, and had won. Not because someone powerful came to save her, because she had been right all along, and she had known it, and she had not stopped knowing it, even when everything around her was designed to make her doubt. Sophia Bennett had built nothing. She had kept what was already built, and she had fought for it with every tool she had. Her receipts, her records, her stubbornness, her willingness to trust carefully and act decisively, and stand in a room full of people who were scared and hand them the piece of the story they'd been missing. The ranch was hers. The land was free. And the woman who had spent 2 years proving everyone wrong was done, proving things not because she'd run out of fight, but because she had finally unambiguously won.